In the 41st millennium, fear is a currency more valuable than faith. The Chaos Gods have hoarded it for 10,000 years, minted it from the screaming deaths of 1 trillion souls, pressed it into the architecture of the warp itself, spent it freely against every champion, saint, and martyr the Imperium had ever raised against them. Fear was their oxygen, their food, the fundamental mechanism by which the Immaterium grew fat and powerful against the material universe. They feared nothing except one thing. And that one thing was currently standing in the strategium of the Macraga's honor, reading a document that should not exist. The parchment was old, not in the way that imperial records grew old, yellowed by neglect and bureaucratic indifference, but old in the way that things touched by the warp-aged, unevenly, in patches, certain words darker than others, as though the ink itself had tried to flee from what it was transcribing. Inquisitor Castiel Vorn had delivered it 3 hours ago without explanation, placing it on the hololithic table with the careful reverence of a man setting down a live grenade, and then stepping back 2 full paces as though proximity to it might constitute a spiritual crime. Roboute Guilliman had not moved since. Around him, the strategium of the flagship breathed with quiet industry. Serfs moved between stations. Cogitators hummed their low mechanical prayers. Shipmaster Vitrian Messinius stood at the far end of the chamber, pretending to study augur readouts, though his eyes kept drifting back to his lord with the particular anxiety of a man watching a storm build on the horizon. The Indomitus Crusade had entered its latest phase 3 weeks ago. Fleet Tertius pushing spinward into the Segmentum Obscurus, pressing the chaos-held worlds that had festered since the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the galaxy open. There was work to do. There were always 1,000 pressing matters requiring the Lord Commander's attention. None of them mattered right now. The document was written in a dialect of dark tongue that had been painstakingly translated by a team of inquisitorial savants, 3 of whom had subsequently been mind-wiped for their own protection. What remained was 12 pages of tactical doctrine, operational philosophy, if such a term could be applied to the servants of entropy, specifically concerning the prosecution of the long war against the Imperium of Man. Guilliman had read 12 pages in 3 hours, not because he was slow, but because every paragraph demanded to be read 3 times. Checked, cross-referenced against a decade of campaign records stored in his eidetic memory. Tested against strategic patterns he had observed over 8 years of the Indomitus Crusade. Because the document, in clinical and unsettling detail, instructed Chaos Warband commanders across 5 war zones to avoid direct engagement with Roboute Guilliman. Not to retreat from him in the way that inferior forces retreat from superior ones. That was simple tactics, unremarkable. But to specifically route their strategic objectives around his presence. To cede ground he was moving toward. To abandon fortifications that his crusade fleet was approaching, even when those fortifications were militarily viable, even when holding them would have served the long war. The doctrine did not frame this as cowardice. It framed it as preservation of assets. It framed Guiliman not as a threat to be countered, but as a phenomenon to be avoided, in the same clinical language that Imperial Navy tacticians used when routing ships around warp storms. He was, in the language of chaos tactical doctrine, an environmental hazard, The implications were staggering, not because the knowledge flattered him. Guilliman had long since learned to distrust flattery, especially the accidental kind, but because of what it revealed about the enemy's psychology. Chaos did not fear his armies. The Indomitus Crusade was powerful, yes, hundreds of fleet assets, millions of soldiers, thousands of Primaris Space Marines representing the Emperor's newest and most devastating investment in the species' survival. But Chaos had faced armies of comparable or greater scale and laughed. Chaos had watched the Siege of Terra and called it entertainment. They feared him, specifically, personally. Guilliman set the document down with the same careful deliberateness with which Inquisitor Vorn had placed it, and for a moment he simply stood with his gauntleted hands flat on the hololithic table, staring at the middle distance with those deep-set eyes that his officers had learned to read the way sailors read weather. This was not the stillness of confusion or uncertainty. This was the stillness of a mind processing something vast, turning it over, examining every facet. Then he looked up at Inquisitor Vorn, who was still standing 2 paces back from the table, doing an admirable job of pretending he wasn't holding his breath. "Where did you find this?" Guilliman asked. "Recovered from a word-bearer's archive on Salmeth 4, Vorn said. "The world was already burning when we arrived. It looked like they'd tried to destroy the records before retreating. This survived. Because they retreated before they could finish destroying it." Guilliman looked back at the document. "They retreated because we were coming." "Yes, my lord." A long silence. Outside the viewports, the void was absolute and indifferent. Somewhere in that darkness, 10,000 years of accumulated hatred was organizing itself with careful intention around the shape of one man's presence. Guilliman almost smiled. "Good," he thought. "Let them be afraid. Fear makes them predictable. And I have been waiting 10,000 years to face a predictable enemy. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions and impossible heroes, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark Millennium." The Lord of Change had a name that took 11 seconds to pronounce correctly and caused mild hemorrhaging in unprotected human minds. So the Daemons under its command simply called it the Architect. It had served Tzeentch for longer than the Imperium had existed, had watched civilizations rise and calcify and crumble from its perch in the crystalline towers of the impossible fortress, had manipulated the fates of kings and primarchs and gods with the casual precision of a master craftsman shaping clay. It had never once retreated from a battle it had chosen to enter, until now. The engagement had begun as a calculated insertion. Fleet Tertius pushing into the Vandris system, 3 inhabited worlds festering under chaos occupation, their populations either dead or worse. Tzeentch's investment in Vandris was not sentimental. The system sat at the confluence of 3 minor warp lanes that, when properly manipulated, could be used to delay Guilliman's crusade by approximately 14 months. 14 months in which a dozen other chaos operations could mature undisturbed. The calculus was elegant. The architect had run it 6,000 times across as many possible futures and found the outcome satisfactory in the overwhelming majority of them. What the architect had not adequately weighted was the variable of Guilliman himself. It manifested above Vandris Prime as the fleet dropped from warp translation its vast form coalescing from the Empyrean with the slow theatricality that Lords of Change favored. Enormous avian wings spreading across a kilometer of void, iridescent feathers catching the light of the system's dying star, 3 eyes of absolute gold scanning the mortal ships below with the contemptuous assessment of a scholar examining insects. Around it, a host of horrors took shape, screamers cutting parabolas through the void, pink horrors clustered in gibbering congregations that warped local space-time, a pair of heralds riding discs of Tzeentch like surfers on an impossible cosmic wave. It was a formidable host. It had broken Imperial fleets 3 times its combat weight through manipulation of probability alone. The architect looked across the void at the Macragge's honor, and it felt something it had not felt in longer than human civilization had existed. It felt the future close, not metaphorically, not as a premonition or a strategic assessment. The architect's greatest gift was the ability to see probability cascades, the branching tree of what might be that Tzeentch's servants navigated like cartographers of fate. When the architect projected forward from this engagement, it saw 10,000 futures fanning out from this moment, as it always did. In 9,843 of them, the architect did not survive the next 6 hours. In the remaining 157, it survived but accomplished nothing of strategic value. There were no futures in which it won. This was not supposed to be possible. The architect had faced Primarchs before, had danced with Magnus the Red himself across the burning surface of Prospero, and called it a reasonable outcome. Primarchs were powerful, yes. Primarchs were dangerous, but they were countable. Their power had shapes and edges that probability could navigate around, futures where their strength became their liability, where their certainty became their blindness. Guiliman had no such edges. What the architect saw when it looked at Guilliman's probability cascade was not a wall or a weapon or even a storm. It saw a tide, patient, inexorable. The kind of force that did not win battles through overwhelming power, but through the simple, devastating accumulation of correct decisions, each one closing off another avenue of chaos advantage, each one making the next correct decision marginally easier, and the next incorrect one marginally more catastrophic. The architect could manipulate fate. It could not manipulate arithmetic. Guilliman was winning the long war one calculated step at a time, and the mathematics did not care about demons. The herald to the architect's left noticed its master's stillness and drifted closer on its disk, its voice a cascade of overlapping tones that conveyed inquiry without ever quite resolving into language. "We withdraw," the architect said. The herald's disk wobbled. Around them, the demonic host stirred with confusion that manifested physically, screamers looping erratically, horrors flickering between pink and blue in rapid anxiety cycling. "The fleet below us has not yet deployed," the herald said, because even Tzeentchian demons occasionally stated the obvious when sufficiently surprised. "No," the architect agreed. "It has not." "Then why?" "Because he is already watching." The architect's 3 golden eyes were fixed on the distant shape of the flagship. "He has already seen us. He is already calculating. Every second we remain here, we give him data. Every move we make becomes a reference point in a model I cannot see the edges of." The great wings folded with a sound like 1,000 secrets being sealed. We are not retreating from a battle. We are refusing to be studied. The herald processed this for a moment. The master will be displeased. The master, the architect said carefully, sent us here knowing we would withdraw. This was never about Vandris. The three eyes finally turned away from the Macraga's honor. This was about seeing how long it would take me to understand why. In the strategium of the flagship, Guiliman watched the demonic host dissolve back into the warp on his Auspex returns. Around him, officers exchanged uncertain looks, a hard-won victory suddenly absent, a battle that had not happened, an enemy that had looked at them across the void and simply left. Guiliman turned to Vorn, who had not left the strategium in 18 hours. "Log it," Guiliman said quietly. "Every detail, the timing of manifestation, the host composition, the exact moment of withdrawal relative to our translation from warp." He paused. "They're not avoiding conflict. They're avoiding information exchange. They don't want me to learn from fighting them." Vorn was already writing. "Which means they believe you would." "Which means," Guiliman corrected gently, "that they already know I do." He looked back at the empty void where a demonic host had been, and his expression was not triumphant. It was something far more dangerous than triumph. It was the focused, patient look of a man who had just confirmed a hypothesis. The Ministorum did not send assassins. That distinction belonged to the Officio Assassinorum, and the High Lords had not yet reached the particular threshold of desperation that authorized that particular solution. What the Ministorum sent instead was Cardinal Vantius Hole, which in many ways was worse. He arrived aboard the Macraga's honor with a retinue of 47 priests and 6 warrior confessors whose faith had been surgically installed alongside their combat implants, and a portable reliquary containing what was allegedly a finger bone of Sebastian Thor. He requested an audience with the Lord Commander with the polished courtesy of a man who had spent 60 years learning how to make requests sound like decrees, and was received in the primary audience chamber with the full weight of imperial protocol. Banners of the Ultramarines hanging alongside the Aquila, honor guards at every pillar, the whole theatrical apparatus of legitimate authority on careful display. Guilliman received him standing. He always stood. Sitting implied patience with proceedings that he could not genuinely afford. "Lord Commander," Cardinal Hole began, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a man who had addressed congregations of millions. "The Ministorum brings greetings from the ecclesiarchal palace and the prayerful concern of the Synod Ministra regarding certain matters of strategic doctrine," Guiliman said. Hall paused. The pause lasted precisely long enough to confirm that Guiliman had named the correct topic. "Spiritual guidance," Hall corrected smoothly. "The Synod has observed with admiration the Lord Commander's prosecution of the Indomitus Crusade. The victories are celebrated. The liberated worlds offer prayers of thanksgiving. However, Guiliman said, the Synod is concerned that a Primarch who wins battles through strategic calculation rather than faith-driven inspiration sets a dangerous precedent for the wider Imperium." Another pause, where this one was fractionally less smooth. The audience chamber smelled of incense that the Cardinal's retinue had been burning since they boarded, a heavy, amber-thick scent that was clearly intended to consecrate the space, to shift the metaphysical atmosphere toward ecclesiarchal authority. It was the kind of subtle environmental manipulation that worked beautifully on imperial officers and planetary governors who had spent their lives breathing Ministorum doctrine along with their air. Guilliman had catalogued it within 30 seconds of the retinue's arrival and said nothing, because noting it aloud would have been unkind, and noting it mentally cost him nothing. The faith of the common soldier is the Imperium's greatest weapon, Hall said, finding his footing again. The Synod believes that a commander who is seen to reason his way to victory, who publishes strategic analyses, who distributes tactical doctrine updates, who communicates the logic of military decisions to the ranks, risks undermining the spiritual foundation upon which imperial morale is built. Soldiers who understand why they are winning may begin to ask why they are fighting. There it was, dressed in theological language, hedged with procedural courtesy, but there it was. Guilliman was quiet for a moment. In that moment, the warrior confessor shifted almost imperceptibly, the way weapons shift when the hand holding them tenses. The honor guards at the pillars did not move at all because they were Ultramarines, and Ultramarines did not fidget. "Cardinal," Guilliman said at last, and his voice had changed register in the way that his senior staff had learned to notice. Not louder, not harder, but more present, like a blade that had been set down on a table rather than kept in a scabbard. "I am going to share an observation with you, and I want you to carry it back to the Synod with the same care with which you carried that reliquary aboard my ship." Hole inclined his head with practiced grace. "Chaos," Guilliman said, "is currently issuing tactical doctrine instructing its commanders to avoid direct engagement with me. Not with my fleets, not with my space marines, with me specifically. Do you understand what that means? The Lord Commander's martial prowess. It means they are afraid of what I know." Guilliman took one step forward, and the sheer physical fact of him, 8 feet of post-human architecture, in armor, blessed by alien gods and forged by the finest minds in 2 millennia of imperial craftsmanship, made the 47 priests collectively hold their breath. They are not afraid of my sword. They have faced swords for 10,000 years. They are afraid that I am learning them, that every engagement, every withdrawal, every tactical choice they make in my presence teaches me something they cannot afford for me to know. They fear my reasoning, Cardinal, the precise faculty your Synod wishes to suppress. The incense smoke curled between them. Somewhere in the reliquary, Sebastian Thor's alleged finger bone rested in its casket, indifferent to the politics of the living. "The Synod's concern," Hall said carefully, "is not suppression, it is balance." "The Synod's concern," Guilliman replied with quiet precision, "is that a Primarch who thinks clearly is harder to manage than one who acts on faith. I understand the concern. I even respect the political instinct behind it." He held the Cardinal's gaze. "But I will not be managed, Your Eminence, not by chaos, not by the High Lords, not by the Ministorum." A pause that carried the weight of 8 years of crusade and 10,000 years of history. "The Emperor built me to think. I intend to honor that purpose." Hall left 3 hours later with his retinue, his reliquary, and the careful neutrality of a man composing his report on the long walk back to his shuttle. The incense smell lingered in the audience chamber for hours afterward. Guiliman stood at the viewport long after they were gone, watching the stars, thinking about the precise intersection of enemies who feared his mind and allies who wanted to limit it, and finding in that intersection something that felt uncomfortably like a strategic opportunity. Khorne did not deliberate. This was, depending on one's perspective, either the blood god's greatest strength or the fundamental flaw in his cosmic architecture. Where Tzeentch calculated and Nurgle waited and Slaanesh seduced, Khorne acted, immediately, absolutely, with the full terrifying weight of a god whose entire existence was the crystallized philosophical argument that violence was the only honest language in the universe. 10,000 years of the Long War had not changed this. The Siege of Terra had not changed this. The emergence of the Cicatrix Maledictum, that great screaming wound in reality that had reshaped the strategic landscape of the galaxy, had not changed this. What changed Khorne's attention, briefly and with volcanic intensity, it was a report from his demon generals that a Lord of Change had retreated from Roboute Guilliman without firing a single shot. The rage that followed this revelation was not metaphorical. In the Brass Citadel, towers that had stood since before humanity learned to write collapsed into the sea of blood at their foundations. 8 bloodthirsters of the first rank were destroyed simply for being present when Khorne received the news. The skulls on the throne of skulls shifted and resettled in a grinding avalanche as the blood god's fury propagated physically through his domain. And across 17 active war zones in the Imperium, Khornate forces suddenly and inexplicably pressed harder, faster, with renewed ferocity. The unconscious overflow of a god's emotion becoming tactical doctrine in real time. Then Khorne thought, not deeply. Deep thought was Tzeentch's province, but with the particular brutal clarity of a mind that had reduced every problem in existence to its essential violence and become very, very good at that singular form of analysis. Tzeentch's architect had run probability cascades and found no future in which it survived. This was because the architect was fighting Guilliman on Guilliman's terms, as a strategic problem to be solved, a variable to be managed, a factor in an equation of futures. Tzeentch had looked at Guilliman and seen a mind, and minds were Tzeentch's territory, and on that territory, Guilliman was apparently unassailable. Khorne did not want to defeat Guilliman's mind. Khorne wanted to break it. The bloodthirster designated Khahran the Unfettered was summoned from the Brass Citadel's deepest fighting pits, where it had been destroying lesser demons for decades as penance for a previous failure too minor to specify and too old to matter. It was enormous even by bloodthirster standards, 4 times the height of a space marine, axe blade spanning 6 meters of consecrated brass, wings that when fully extended created a thermal pressure wave that could knock armored infantry from their feet at 30 meters. It had personally killed 3 Space Marine chapter masters, 2 Orc war bosses of the first magnitude, and an Eldar Phoenix Lord whose name the Eldar still refused to speak aloud. Khorne gave it a single instruction, delivered not in words, but in pure intent, burned directly into Khahran's brainstem with the force of divine command. Do not kill Guilliman. Make him watch everything around him die. The instruction was elegant in its cruelty. It understood, in the way that even Khorne's blunt intelligence could understand when motivated by sufficient fury, that Guilliman's true power was not his sword arm, or his armor, or his superhuman physiology. His power was what he built, the networks of trust and strategy and resurgent imperial strength that he assembled around himself like a second armor. The soldiers who fought better because he existed. The officers whose decisions improved under his influence. The worlds that recovered faster because his strategic doctrine gave them frameworks for reconstruction. Destroy all of that, and the mind at the center had nothing to calculate with. The strategist without an army was just a man in expensive armor standing in a field of ash. Khahran arrived in the Valdris Reach 2 days ahead of Fleet Tertius's projected arrival, manifesting not through warp translation, but through a direct tear in reality that left a wound in local space-time that smelled of hot brass and copper for weeks afterward. It came not with a host. Khorne's instruction had been specific about that, because a host would give Guilliman something to counter, and countering was what Guilliman did, but with a handful of flesh hounds and a singular devastating focus. It hit the 114th Cadian Armored Brigade while they were consolidating a beachhead on Valdris Secundus. The 114th were not exceptional soldiers by the cruel calculus of the Astra Militarum. They were competent, experienced, appropriately fatalistic, and they had survived 6 engagements in the Indomitus Crusade through the combination of disciplined fire, good officers, and the statistical mercy of battles that needed them to live long enough to hold ground. They had 47 Leman Russ battle tanks, 3 Basilisk artillery platforms, 12,000 infantry, and a regimental standard that had been carried unbroken for 230 years. Khahran destroyed them in 4 hours, not because they fought poorly. They fought with the particular desperate excellence of soldiers who understand that they are going to lose and choose to make losing expensive. The basilisks found their range in the first 20 minutes and landed 3 direct hits that would have killed anything short of a god. The Leman Russ formations coordinated with textbook precision, angling to concentrate fire on the bloodthirster's wings and limit its mobility, buying the infantry time to fall back to defensible positions. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Guilliman received the report 6 hours after the last Vox signal from the 114th's command element. He read it standing at the same hololithic table where this had all begun, with Vorn beside him and Messenius at the far end of the chamber, and the same quiet industry of the strategium continuing around them all. The report was precise. Indomitus fleet doctrine mandated precise reports even when the content was devastating. 12,000 soldiers, 230 years of regimental history. Gone. Guilliman was silent for a long time. "It didn't try to hold the ground," he said finally. "It destroyed the unit and withdrew. It didn't establish a position, didn't fortify, didn't build toward a strategic objective." He looked up from the report. This wasn't tactical. This was a message. Vorn said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. "Khorne is telling me," Guilliman continued quietly, "that it can reach the people around me faster than I can protect them. That my strategic genius is irrelevant when the enemy's objective isn't victory. It's grief." He set the report down. It wants me to feel responsible. It wants that weight to slow my thinking." He straightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Not grief, not anger, but a cold and luminous clarity that his officers found in moments like this more frightening than either. "Note the withdrawal pattern," he said to Vorn. "Note the specific unit targeted. I cross-reference with our projected route through the Reach." He turned back to the hololithic display, and his hands were already moving across the controls. "Korn just told me something it didn't intend to. It's been watching our fleet movements long enough to know which units are least protected. That requires sustained surveillance." He began pulling up augur records from the past 30 days. "Which means there's a fixed observation point. And fixed points," Roboute Guilliman said, with a quiet certainty that made even the cogitators seem to hush. "Can be found." The Tau Watercast envoy's name was Porui Dalyth Vael, and she had been waiting for 43 days in a diplomatic holding suite aboard a neutral void station at the edge of the Valdris Reach, with the particular patient composure that Watercast operatives spent decades cultivating, and that concealed, in Vael's specific case, an anxiety that had been building since the moment she understood the full contents of the document she was carrying. The Tau Empire did not typically insert itself into Imperial military operations. The greater goods expansion had its own momentum, its own carefully managed frontiers, its own complex relationship with a humanity that the Tau simultaneously admired, pitied, and found strategically inconvenient. But the Ethereals had made a calculation, the kind of long, slow, multi-generational calculation that Tau strategic doctrine excelled at, and the calculation had produced a conclusion that even the most senior Earth-cast analysts found uncomfortable. Roboute Guilliman was either the greatest threat the Tau Empire would face in the next 2 centuries, or the closest thing to a rational actor the Imperium had produced in 10 millennia. Possibly both simultaneously. Vael rose when Guiliman entered the conference suite, which was a Watercast courtesy gesture indicating respect without submission, a distinction that the Tau spent considerable diplomatic energy maintaining. She was tall for Tau, blue-gray skinned, with a characteristically flat face and wide eyes that humans consistently misread as either innocent or alien, when the correct reading was simply different. She wore no weapons. She carried a data slate and a sealed diplomatic case, and the careful neutrality of a professional who had been briefed extensively on what happened to Tau envoys, who let their genuine opinions show too early in a negotiation. Guiliman sat. This surprised her. She had read every available report on his audience protocols, and sitting was not in the documented behavioral repertoire for early-stage meetings. She adjusted her opening posture accordingly, which he noticed, which she noticed him noticing, and for a moment the two of them simply assessed each other across the table with the mutual recognition of people who were accustomed to reading rooms and had just found someone else in the room doing the same thing. "You've been waiting 43 days, Guiliman said. "The document warranted patience," Vael replied. Her Imperial Gothic was precise and barely accented, the product of Watercast language immersion programs that had been refining themselves for generations. "We were uncertain how to request this meeting without triggering an inquisitorial response," You transmitted a specific encryption signature on a frequency that matched Inquisitor Vorn's personal cipher, Guilliman said. Not close enough to be mistaken for an actual inquisitorial communication, but close enough that automated screening protocols would flag it for human review rather than immediate interdiction. He tilted his head slightly. You wanted Vorn to find you specifically, because you'd assessed that Vorn would bring it to me rather than processing it through standard inquisitorial channels. Vielle allowed herself the small luxury of genuine surprise. That assessment took our analysts 11 days to complete. I had the benefit of knowing Vorn personally. Guilliman nodded toward the diplomatic case. Show me what you have. What Vielle had was an intercepted communication that the Tau's extensive signals intelligence network, far more sophisticated than the Imperium generally acknowledged, a fact the Tau had strong strategic reasons for maintaining, had recovered from a chaos-encrypted Vox burst 3 weeks ago. The decryption had taken the Earthcast's best cryptographic minds 6 days and had left 2 of them requiring psychological reconstruction afterward, which Vielle did not mention because it seemed like the kind of detail that would raise questions she wasn't authorized to answer. The communication was between entities that the Tau analysts had tentatively identified as high-ranking chaos strategic coordinators, not demon lords, not mortal champions, but something in between, the kind of organizational layer that emerged when chaos needed to accomplish something that required sustained planning rather than pure violent expression. The language was partially symbolic, partially encoded, partially in a dialect that had required the Tau to consult sources that Vielle was also not authorized to discuss. But the core content was legible. Guilliman read it twice. Then he read it a third time, which Vielle noted because it was the second occasion in this investigation that he had read something 3 times, and Watercast training had taught her that repetition in a subject of demonstrated intelligence indicated not confusion, but the careful management of a significant reaction. The document described a strategic conference, not a battle plan, a conference with all the organizational infrastructure that implied agenda items, attendee lists, designated speakers, a location that had been redacted, but whose coordinates bracketed a region of space that Guilliman's eidetic memory immediately cross-referenced against 3 war zones, 2 active chaos fortifications, and 1 location that should have been strategically irrelevant, but suddenly wasn't. The attendees, identified by epithet rather than name, which was standard chaos operational security, included representatives of all 4 major chaos powers. This was not normal. This was, in the entire recorded history of the Long War, essentially unprecedented. The Chaos Gods were not cooperative entities. Their philosophical opposition was not merely political. It was metaphysical, baked into the fundamental nature of the warp itself. Tzeentch and Nurgle stood in eternal opposition. Khorne despised Slaanesh. The organizational friction between their mortal and demonic servants was not a weakness to be exploited so much as a geological constant, as reliable as gravity. They were meeting, all 4, together, with a shared agenda. The agenda had 1 item, Guilliman. When was this transmitted? He asked. 17 days ago, Vielle said. The conference, based on the logistical references in the communication, is estimated to occur within the next 30 days. Guilliman set the data slate down with the same careful deliberateness that was becoming, his staff had noted, a tell. The physical management of a mind processing something it found genuinely significant. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Vielle had prepared for this question. She had 17 different answers ready, arranged by diplomatic utility and strategic honesty in a hierarchy that the Watercast had spent centuries refining. She chose the most honest one, because her assessment of Guiliman suggested that the most honest answer was also, in this specific case, the most strategically useful. "Because the Tau Empire has run its own probability assessments," she said, "and the outcomes in which Roboute Guilliman fails are considerably worse for the greater good than the outcomes in which he succeeds." She held his gaze. "We are not offering alliance. We are offering information, because informed enemies of chaos are preferable to uninformed ones, regardless of their political relationship with the Tau Empire." Guilliman studied her for a long moment. "And what does the greater good want in return?" "Nothing immediately," Vielle said. "We want you to know that we gave you this. We want that knowledge to exist between our civilizations, quietly, as a foundation." She paused. "The ethereals believe that a man who thinks as clearly as you do will eventually understand why that foundation matters." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that exists when two people have understood each other completely and are deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Tell your ethereals," Guilliman said at last, "that I understand already, and that I will remember this." He stood, which ended the meeting in the most unambiguous possible way. "Tell them also that remembering is not the same as agreeing, but it is a beginning." Vielle bowed, a gesture she had practiced for this specific cultural context, and began gathering her materials. At the door, she paused. "Lord Commander," she said, "the conference location, once you identify it." She hesitated with the precision of someone choosing their final words very carefully. "Do not go alone." Guilliman said nothing, but she saw in the particular set of his expression as she left that he had already considered going alone and had not yet decided against it. Nurgle was patient. This was not a virtue in the way that human philosophy understood virtue, not the cultivated discipline of a mind choosing restraint over impulse, not the hard-won stillness of a warrior who had learned when not to strike. Nurgle's patience was biological, ecological, the deep geological patience of decay itself. Rot did not hurry. Plague did not set deadlines. The slow consumption of living things by entropy was the most fundamental process in the material universe, and Nurgle had simply made himself its avatar, its loving custodian, the benevolent father of everything that festered and spread, and eventually, tenderly returned all things to their component parts. He had been watching Guilliman since the Primarch's resurrection, not with the focused tactical attention that Khorne had brought to the problem, or the probabilistic obsession that had driven Tzeentch's architect to its humiliating withdrawal. Nurgle watched the way a gardener watches a particularly interesting weed, with curiosity, with professional respect, with the comfortable certainty that given sufficient time, everything grew in the directions that entropy preferred. The Indomitus Crusade was impressive. The Primaris Space Marines were a genuine complication. The strategic doctrine updates and the rebuilt supply lines and the re-established communication networks were the kind of civilizational infrastructure that made Nurgle's work harder in the short term. In the long term, of course, all infrastructure crumbled. Nurgle's campaign against Guilliman was not announced. It did not manifest as a demonic host or a plague fleet or any of the theatrical instruments of divine displeasure that the other chaos gods defaulted to when sufficiently motivated. It manifested as weather patterns on 3 agri-worlds in Fleet Tertius's supply corridor, as a subtle mutation in the grain fungus that processed promethium on Valdris Tertius, as a water table contamination on the forge world of Heth's Landing that the Mechanicus adepts diagnosed as industrial runoff and treated accordingly because the alternative diagnosis required a theological escalation that the senior magos preferred to avoid. It manifested most significantly as Sergeant Arden Crail of the Ultramarines' 5th Company, who began coughing 3 weeks after the fleet's departure from the Vandris system, and who reported to the apothecary on the 4th day because Ultramarines reported symptoms promptly, and who was placed in quarantine on the 7th day when the apothecary noted that the cough was not responding to any treatment in the Standard Astartes medical database. By the 14th day, there were 6 Ultramarines in quarantine. By the 21st day, there were 19, and the Apothecary Prime had sent a sealed report to Guilliman that used the phrase unknown biological agent 4 times and Nurglite vector twice, with the careful hedging of a man who was professionally certain and institutionally reluctant. Guilliman read the report at 0300 ship time, alone in his private strategium, with the lights at half power and the void outside the viewport absolute and indifferent. He read it with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, cross-referencing the Apothecary Prime's findings against his own knowledge of chaos plague mechanics, against the supply chain records for the past 6 weeks, against the reported weather anomalies on 3 agri-worlds that he had flagged 2 weeks ago as statistically improbable but not yet actionable. The picture that assembled itself was, once fully formed, almost elegant in its construction. Nurgle was not trying to kill his soldiers. He was trying to make Guilliman slow down. A plague that killed space marines quickly would be addressed quickly. The Imperium had extensive experience with Nurglite biological warfare, and the Astartes medical infrastructure, while not infallible, was formidably developed. A plague that killed slowly, and that demanded ongoing medical attention, that required supply diversions and quarantine protocols and the kind of sustained logistical management that consumed planning bandwidth. That was a different instrument entirely. Every hour Guilliman spent coordinating the medical response was an hour not spent advancing toward the conference location that the Tau intelligence had identified. Every resource diverted to contamination control was a resource not available for the strategic operation he was assembling. Nurgle was not attacking the crusade. Nurgle was making the crusade expensive. Guilliman stood and walked to the viewport, and for a long moment he simply looked at the stars with an expression that none of his staff would have recognized because none of them were present to see it. Something that was neither the cold strategic clarity of his command mode nor the carefully managed composure of his public presence, but something older and more tired and more honest than either. He was 8 years into a crusade that would take decades. He was one man, post-human and blessed and armored by alien gods, but still finite, still bounded by the hours in a day and the processing capacity of even a Primarch's mind. And the enemies he faced had eternity. They had 10,000 years of practice at finding the specific friction points in human endurance, the places where competence became exhaustion, where determination became rigidity, where the very qualities that made a commander effective became the vectors through which attrition entered. Nurgle understood something about Guilliman that Khorne's rage and Tzeentch's calculation had missed. The Lord Commander was not invincible because of his strength. He was invincible because he refused to stop. And the most effective weapon against a man who refused to stop was not a blade or a plague or a demonic host. It was the simple, grinding, patient accumulation of more things to deal with, until the weight of them slowed the relentless forward momentum that made him dangerous. Guilliman turned away from the viewport. He spent the next 6 hours not managing the plague response. He had officers for that, and using them correctly was itself a strategic discipline. But designing a new supply chain architecture that removed the 3 compromised agri-worlds from Fleet Tertius's logistics network entirely and replaced them with alternatives that were less efficient but harder to contaminate. He drafted the framework in 2 hours and spent the remaining 4 testing it against 30 different disruption scenarios, looking for the places where Nurgle's patience could find purchase in the new system. He found 11 vulnerabilities. He addressed 8 immediately and flagged 3 as acceptable risks given the operational timeline. Then he called his senior Medicaid staff, assigned clear chains of responsibility for the quarantine situation, established a reporting protocol that would give him decision-relevant information without drowning him in data, and returned to the strategic problem of the conference location. In the Garden of Nurgle, somewhere in the soft, rotting warmth of the grandfather's domain, something that served as the plague, God's attention turned briefly toward the Macrage's honor and registered what was happening with the slow, interested regard of a naturalist observing an unexpected adaptation in a familiar species. Guilliman was rebuilding faster than Nurgle could rot, not permanently, not definitively. Entropy was still entropy, and time still favored the patient. But the specific campaign, the careful, elegant, slow war that Nurgle had designed to grind the Primarch's momentum to a halt, was not producing the expected yield. The grandfather adjusted his calculations with the unhurried thoroughness of a gardener, replanning a garden that had grown in unexpected directions. Somewhere in the adjustment, buried beneath the comfortable certainty of inevitable decay, was something that Nurgle's servants had not heard from their god in a very long time. A note of genuine interest, not admiration. Nurgle did not admire resistance in the way that mortals understood admiration, but he found it interesting in the way that a naturalist finds an organism that refuses to follow the expected biological script interesting, with curiosity, with the particular pleasure of the unexpected, and with the patient certainty that even the most interesting organisms eventually joined the great cycle. Guilliman did not know about the note of interest. He was already working on the next problem. This was, Nurgle reflected, precisely what made him so very interesting. Slaanesh did not send a demon. This was the detail that should have warned Guilliman, and would have, had the approach not been so exquisitely constructed to bypass the specific perceptual filters that a mind like his maintained against exactly this kind of intrusion. Khorne had sent violence, Nurgle had sent rot, Tzeentch had sent probability. These were instruments that Guilliman's strategic framework was built to identify and counter, threat vectors with established signatures, and documented response protocols refined across 8 years of crusade and 10,000 years of imperial military history. Slaanesh sent a dream. It came on the 42nd day after the Tau envoy's visit, that during the 4 hours of enforced rest that Guilliman's medical staff had negotiated into his schedule through the combined leverage of Apothecary Prime Thessian's professional authority and the quiet, persistent advocacy of Shipmaster Massinius, who had on 3 separate occasions physically removed data slates from the Lord Commander's hands and replaced them with nothing. Guilliman slept rarely and lightly, in the manner of Primarchs who had spent centuries treating unconsciousness as a tactical vulnerability. But he slept, and in the sleeping, the defenses that his waking mind maintained with the automatic discipline of breathing dropped by precisely the margin that Slaanesh required. The dream was not seductive in the way that Slaanesh's temptations were documented to be seductive. Not sensation, not excess, not the operatic pleasures that the Prince of Chaos offered to warriors and artists and emperors who wanted to feel everything at once. Slaanesh had studied Guilliman with the particular attentiveness of a predator that had watched its prey escape 3 previous hunters, and what Slaanesh offered Roboute Guilliman was the one thing that no sword or plague or probability cascade had managed to give him. A perfect Imperium. It assembled itself around him with the slow, convincing thoroughness of a dream that knew it was a dream and had decided to be convincing anyway. The Macraga's honor was there, but clean in a way that Imperial ships were never clean. Not the institutional cleanliness of a well-maintained warship, but the deep, structural cleanliness of a civilization that had solved the problems that produced grime. The crew moved with purpose and without fear. The Vox channels carried information rather than prayers. The Mechanicus adepts spoke in comprehensible language about systems that functioned as designed rather than as miracles. Somewhere in the distance, through a viewport that showed a star system rather than the void between them, a world turned in healthy orbit. Not a hive world choked with uncountable billions living in conditions that made death a mercy, but a world with visible green, with weather patterns that suggested managed ecology, with the orbital infrastructure of a civilization that was building something rather than simply surviving. Guilliman walked through it with the careful attention of a man who knew he was being shown something and was determined to understand what. It was not a lie. That was the first thing he established, because Slaanesh was subtle enough to understand that showing Guilliman an obvious lie would end the dream immediately, and Slaanesh wanted him to stay. The Imperium he was walking through was built from his own vision, the Imperium Secundus that he had dreamed of during the heresy, the civilization that he had outlined in the Codex Astartes, and the broader administrative reforms that the High Lords had been systematically undermining for 8 years. It was not a fantasy. It was a blueprint rendered real, given flesh and light, and the particular texture of things that had actually been built by hands that believed in what they were building. It was what he was fighting for, made present, made tangible, given to him now, complete, instead of at the end of decades of crusade and political attrition and the grinding institutional resistance of an imperium that had calcified around its own dysfunction for 10 millennia. You could have this, the dream said, in a voice that had no direction and no face, that came from the architecture of the vision itself, rather than from any identifiable speaker, not as a reward, not as a gift, as a choice. The Imperium you're building will take a century. The Imperium you're fighting will resist every step. The High Lords will undermine you. The ecclesiarchy will work against you. The very soldiers you're liberating will be drafted into a system that will grind them down within a generation. Guilliman walked to the viewport and looked at the green world turning in its orbit. What if it didn't have to take a century? The question landed with a precision that told him everything he needed to know about who was asking it, because it was not the question of a tempter offering shortcuts. It was the question of an entity that had studied him long enough to understand that Roboute Guilliman was not tempted by power or sensation or glory. He was tempted by efficiency, by the possibility of the right answer arrived at faster, by the vision of the thing he was building, completed before more people died in the building of it. Slaanesh had found the one door in Guilliman's psychological architecture that was not reinforced by doctrine or discipline or the 10,000-year inheritance of imperial military philosophy. It had found the door marked impatience. The price, the dream continued, is not what you think. Not corruption, not damnation, not the surrender of your values. A pause that felt like breath, like the moment before a sentence that changes everything. Only the surrender of your method. Become something that achieves the goal directly, without the friction of working through broken systems and compromised institutions. Become something that does not need to persuade, or wait, or negotiate with cardinals who want to limit your thinking. Become something that simply is the Imperium. The green world continued turning. Guilliman stood at the viewport for a long time. Then he said, aloud, in the dream, in a voice that carried the full weight of a man who had considered the offer genuinely and completely and was answering from the deepest available layer of his actual self. The Imperium I'm building is not a destination, it's a method. A civilization that arrives at the right answer through force is not a civilization. It's an occupation. He paused. I have read enough history to know the difference. I have lived enough history to know the difference. He turned away from the viewport and faced the empty, beautiful room. And I know that the entity offering me this understands the difference perfectly and is offering it precisely because it would erase that distinction in the moment of acceptance. The dream did not collapse dramatically. It simply thinned the way mist thins in morning light, the convincing texture of it becoming transparent and then absent, until Guilliman was standing in his quarters aboard the Macragge's Honor, with the real ship's sounds around him, and the real void outside his actual viewport, and the data slate on his desk already illuminated with 17 pending matters requiring his attention. He sat on the edge of his bunk, An uncharacteristic posture, the posture of a man allowing himself 30 seconds of something that was not quite vulnerability, but was adjacent to it, and stared at the middle distance. Slaanesh had shown him his own deepest desire and made it feel like a temptation, which meant that the desire itself was real, that the impatience was real, that somewhere beneath the strategic clarity and the post-human discipline and the 8 years of relentless forward momentum was a man who was tired, who wanted the work to be done, who had woken from 10,000 years of darkness to find everything he'd built in ruins and had been rebuilding ever since, with the knowledge that he might not live to see it finished, even with a Primarch's lifespan. Slaanesh had not tempted him. Slaanesh had diagnosed him. Guilliman picked up the data slate. He began working through the 17 pending matters with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had decided, consciously and completely, that the method was the point, that the slow, grinding, friction-filled work of building through broken systems and compromised institutions was not a regrettable necessity on the way to the real goal. It was the real goal, because a civilization that could only be built by a Primarch was not a civilization. It was a dependency. He flagged the dream in his private log with 3 words: Slaanesh, impatience, noted, and moved on to the next problem, which was the conference location, which Vorn had finally triangulated, which was exactly where Guilliman's cross-reference of the Tau intelligence and his own augur records had suggested it would be. 30 days. The conference was in 30 days. He had 29. The conference location was a dead system. Not dead in the way that uninhabited systems were dead, cold, silent, simply awaiting the eventual attention of imperial expansion, but dead in the purposeful way that chaos made things dead, the way that the warp's overflow into the materium left locations spiritually cauterized, their history burned out of them, their physical laws subtly rewritten by sustained proximity to the immaterium until the rocks themselves seemed to remember violence. The system had no name in Imperial records. It appeared in Mechanicus stellar cartography as a reference number and a notation that 3 survey ships had entered it over 2 centuries, and none had returned, which in Mechanicus documentation language was as close to do not enter as the cult Mechanicus permitted itself to write. It had a star that burned in a color that stars were not supposed to burn. It had 4 planets, 3 of which were geometrically wrong in ways that the human eye processed as nausea rather than observation. The 4th was a flat, dark, airless rock with a surface temperature that fluctuated in patterns that suggested not orbital mechanics but preference, as though the temperature of the ground was expressing something rather than simply responding to physics. It was, Inquisitor Vorn observed, when Guilliman showed him the triangulated coordinates, a perfectly terrible place to go. Yes, Guilliman agreed, which is why we're going to take the fight to them before they finalize their coordination. Vorn looked at the coordinates for a long moment. My lord, if all 4 chaos powers have representatives at this location simultaneously, the combined demonic and empiric presence will be unprecedented, Guilliman said. I know. That's also why we're going. He brought up the hololithic display and overlaid the conference location against Fleet Tertius's current position, against the estimated arrival windows of the other Crusade fleets, against the 30-day countdown that the Tau intelligence had established. The geometry was uncomfortable. Fleet Tertius could reach the system in 18 days at maximum sustainable warp transit speed, which left 12 days of operational window before the conference was estimated to conclude. If they complete this conference, they will have an agreed strategic doctrine specifically designed to counter my campaign. Individually, I have demonstrated we can manage their approaches. Coordinated, and they will be significantly more effective. If we interrupt the conference, Vorn said carefully, we will be engaging all 4 Chaos powers simultaneously. Potentially. Guilliman moved pieces on the hololithic display with the focused economy of a man thinking through a problem he had already substantially solved. Or we will be engaging 4 Chaos powers who are in the middle of disagreeing with each other in a location that has not been prepared for military defense because it was selected for secrecy rather than fortification, with the element of surprise that their own operational security has denied them the ability to anticipate. He looked up. They went to considerable lengths to ensure I didn't know about this meeting. They will not have planned for the possibility that I do. Vorn said nothing for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words in full awareness that they would be noted, you're going to use the fact that they fear you as a tactical instrument. I'm going to use the fact that they fear me as a weapon, Guilliman corrected quietly. There is a difference. A tactical instrument is something you deploy. A weapon is something you are. The fleet preparation took 9 days. Not because 9 days was the minimum required. Guilliman's staff could have managed the logistics in 6, but because 9 days done correctly was worth more than 6 days done hastily, and Guilliman had long since internalized the discipline of resisting the urgency that impatience generated in favor of the thoroughness that success required. He thought occasionally of Slanesh's dream, and found that the memory of it functioned as a useful calibration tool, a reminder of what he was not doing and why the distinction mattered. He assembled a strike force rather than a fleet engagement. Fleet Tertius would hold position at the system's edge. The penetrating element would be small, fast, and structured not for sustained combat, but for disruption. The kind of operation that was not about winning a battle, but about making a battle impossible to finish. 12 strike cruisers. 8 companies of Primaris Space Marines drawn from 4 different chapters. A diversity that was intentional because it meant the operation's composition could not be leaked through any single chapter's intelligence channels. 2 inquisitorial black ships carrying Psyker assets that Vorn had been assembling for 3 months in anticipation of exactly this kind of engagement. And Guilliman himself, in the armor of fate, carrying the Emperor's sword. There were conversations during those 9 days that did not appear in official records. The most significant was with shipmaster Messinius, who came to the private strategium on the 7th evening and stood in the doorway for a moment before Guilliman acknowledged him, which was itself unusual. Guilliman generally acknowledged people when they entered rooms because awareness of one's environment was a discipline. "You knew I was there," Messinius said. "For approximately 40 seconds, Guilliman confirmed. You were deciding whether to come in or leave. I didn't want to make the decision for you. Messenius came in. He stood across the hololithic table in the half-light of the strategium with the particular posture of a man who had something to say that he had not been authorized to say and had decided to say it anyway, which was one of the qualities that had kept him in this post for 6 years. The Tau envoy said not to go alone, Messenius said. I'm not going alone. I'm taking 8 companies and 2 black ships. You know what she meant? Guilliman looked at him. Yes. And? A silence that was not evasive, but contemplative. The silence of a man checking his own reasoning one more time, not because he doubted it, but because the habit of verification was too deeply installed to skip, even when the conclusion was already settled. The core of what chaos fears about me is not my sword or my army, Guilliman said. It's that I think clearly in situations designed to prevent clear thinking. If I go into that system surrounded by enough force to feel protected, I will start managing the force instead of thinking about the enemy. I need to be uncomfortable enough to stay focused. Messenius absorbed this. That is either the most strategically sophisticated reasoning I've ever heard, he said, or it's what Slaanesch's temptation looks like from the inside when it's working. Guilliman was quiet for long enough that the silence acquired a specific quality, not the silence of a man who had no answer, but the silence of a man who found the question genuinely worth sitting with. That possibility, he said at last, is exactly why you're coming with me. On the 18th day, Fleet Tertius translated into the dead system and immediately encountered something that none of the tactical projections had accounted for, which was the first indication that the operation was proceeding exactly as Guilliman had expected. The conference had started early. The 4th planet, the dark, airless rock with the temperature that expressed preference rather than physics, was lit from below, great columns of empiric light rising from its surface like inverse lightning, reaching toward the system's wrongly colored star with the focused intensity of a ritual in its final stages. Around it, in a loose cordon that was simultaneously a defensive perimeter and a gathering, demonic entities of all 4 chaos powers moved in their separate orbits, not fighting, and not yet the instinctive hostility between them, suppressed by whatever coordinating mechanism had made this meeting possible in the first place. On the Auspex returns, Vorn counted 11 greater demons. They moved the timeline up, he said. Yes, Guilliman said, studying the returns with the focused attention of a man recalculating rather than reconsidering. They suspected we might be coming. He traced the cordon pattern with one finger. Note the positioning of the Tsinchian elements. They're not facing outward, they're facing each other. He looked up. They don't trust the coordination. They're here because they had to be here, not because they wanted to be. The conference is under strain. The Emperor's sword hummed at his side, a low resonance that was not quite sound, but registered in the chest like the first warning of a thunderstorm. Good. Strained conferences make poor doctrine. He looked at Messenius. Signal the strike cruisers, Guilliman said. We go in now, before they finish, not because we can destroy them all, we cannot, but because a conference that ends in battle produces no coordinated strategy. The ghost of something that was almost satisfaction moved across his expression. We're not here to win a fight. We're here to ruin a meeting." The dead system had a sound. Not sound in the way that vacuum permitted sound. It did not. And the void between the strike cruisers and the fourth planet was as physically silent as physics required. But a pressure that the psychers aboard the black ships registered as sound. That pressed against the enhanced sensory apparatus of the Primarch Space Marines like a frequency tuned specifically to biological discomfort, that Guiliman himself felt as a weight behind his eyes and a harmonic in his back teeth, that the armor of fate's protective wards were working continuously to suppress. The warp was close here, not bleeding through, not yet, but leaning against the membrane of reality with the patient, terrible weight of something very large, pressing against a door that was not quite locked. The 11 greater demons registered Fleet Tertius's arrival with the collective attention of entities that did not experience surprise, but experienced the functional equivalent. A recalibration, a reassessment, a moment of unified focus that briefly and revealingly interrupted the interfaction hostility that Guiliman had correctly identified as the conference's structural weakness. In that moment of unified focus, Guiliman launched the strike. Not the strike cruisers. Not the 8 companies of Primarch Space Marines in their deployment bays, weapons hot, awaiting the signal with the particular coiled readiness of enhanced soldiers who had been briefed on the objective and understood that the objective was unusual. Not the black ships with their psyker assets, not the coordinated void warfare assets that Fleet Tertius was positioning at the system's edge. Guilliman launched a Vox transmission. It went out on 17 frequencies simultaneously, including 3 that were theoretically only receivable by entities partially present in the warp, which the black ship's psyker arrays could generate under specific conditions and which Vorn had spent 6 days preparing them to generate. It was not encrypted. It was not coded. It was intended to be received by every entity in the system, material and empiric, without ambiguity or filter. It said, "I know why you're here. I know what you're trying to build, and I want you to understand, before this proceeds any further, that the fact that you are here, together, all 4 of you, in the same system, at the same time with a shared agenda, is the most significant tactical intelligence I have gathered in 8 years of crusade. Whatever doctrine you produce in this conference, I will have already begun accounting for it. Whatever coordination you achieve here, I will spend the next decade systematically dismantling. Not because I am more powerful than you, but because I understand you, all 4 of you, individually and collectively. An understanding, Roboute Guilliman, transmitted into the dead system with the full weight of a Primarch's certainty, is the only advantage that matters in a war that has lasted 10,000 years. The silence that followed the transmission lasted 4 seconds. Then the conference collapsed. Not metaphorically, physically, structurally, with the kinetic reality of 11 greater demons simultaneously deciding that the coordinating mechanism that had suppressed their interfaction hostility was less important than the instinctive responses that the transmission had triggered in each of them individually. The bloodthirster that represented Khorne's interests turned toward the nearest Tzeentchian herald with the automatic aggression of a god's rage redirected by wounded pride. The Lord of Change that had replaced the Architect, a different entity, more senior, dispatched specifically for this conference, spread its wings with the threat display of an entity that had just heard its master's deepest strategic fear stated aloud by an enemy and was processing the implications with the particular Tzeentchian combination of fury and compulsive analysis. The Nurglite representatives began their slow, inevitable expansion. The suppression lifted, their plague bodies resuming the growth that proximity to Kornati entities had been holding in uncomfortable check. The Slaaneshi delegation simply laughed. It was the laughter that concerned Guiliman most, because it was the laughter of an entity that had found something genuinely funny in a way that suggested comprehension rather than dismissal. And Slaanesh's comprehension was always more dangerous than Slaanesh's rage. "Strike cruisers," Guiliman said. "Now." The 8 strike cruisers drove into the system with the focused aggression of vessels that had been designed not for prolonged engagement, but for decisive intervention. Fast attack profiles, prow lances cut a coordinated lines through the empiric cordon that the demonic gathering had established. The disruption not intended to destroy the greater demons, but to interrupt their reformation of cohesion, to keep the conference that had been from reconstituting itself into a battle that could be won. In Guilliman's own transport, a Thunderhawk that had been modified in ways that its original Mechanicus designers would have found theologically disturbing, drove straight for the 4th planet's surface. Messinius was in the co-pilot position. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. They hit atmosphere, thin, wrong, tasting of copper and old mathematics even through sealed helm systems. And the planet's surface resolved from the abstract geometry of auspex returns into the concrete, physical reality of a place where something enormously significant had been happening and had been interrupted before completion. The ritual infrastructure was visible from the air. Vast geometric patterns carved into the dark rock, not with tools, but with the kind of focused empiric pressure that left stone looking melted and resolidified in new configurations. Glowing in the colors of all 4 chaos powers in the overlapping, clashing way of a project that had been collaborative without being harmonious. At the center of the pattern, something remained. It was not a demon. It was not a mortal. It was the residue of the conference's intended product, the strategic coordination that all 4 powers had been building toward, not yet fully formed, but not entirely dispersed, existing in the ambiguous space between intention and manifestation that the warp occasionally produced when sufficiently motivated ritual was interrupted before completion. It had no fixed shape. It cycled through forms that suggested each of the 4 chaos powers in rapid succession, as though unable to settle on a single philosophical identity, because it had been built from 4 incompatible ones. Guiliman stepped out of the Thunderhawk and looked at it. It looked back with the combined attention of 4 divine intelligences operating through a single unfinished vessel, and what it saw was a man in armor standing on a dark rock in a dead system with a sword that hummed with the distilled faith of 1,000,000 worlds and eyes that showed no fear whatsoever. "You made a mistake," Guilliman said to it. To them, to the 4 gods whose attention was present in the flickering residue before him. "You made me the center of your strategy. You organized around my presence. You let fear of what I represent dictate your operational priorities." He drew the Emperor's sword, and the blade's light was the particular quality of light that existed before illumination was a physical phenomenon, older than the dead star above them, older than the warp itself, the light of a time when the universe had not yet decided what it was going to be. An enemy who fears you is an enemy who has already told you everything about their weaknesses. The residue cycled faster, the four-way philosophical incompatibility becoming a physical instability as the greater demons above the planet, distracted, fighting each other with the liberated aggression of entities whose cooperation had always been a suppressed violence, failed to maintain the empiric connection that was keeping it coherent. Guilliman crossed the distance between himself and the residue in 4 strides and drove the Emperor's sword into the center of the pattern. What happened next was not an explosion. Explosions were material events, governed by physics, bounded by the conservation of energy. What happened was more fundamental than that. A resolving, a closure, the sound of a sentence that had been left unfinished for 10,000 years, finally reaching its period. The ritual patterns carved into the dark rock went dark in sequence, each one extinguishing as the empiric connection that had powered it was severed, moving outward from the sword's point of contact like a wave of ordinary darkness replacing the wrong light. Above the planet, the 11 greater demons came apart, not destroyed, banished, a return to the warp with the force of an argument they had not anticipated and could not immediately counter. The cooperative framework that had brought them together dissolved by the destruction of the thing they had been building together. Without it, there was no conference. Without the conference, there was no shared purpose. Without shared purpose, 4 powers whose fundamental nature was incompatibility had nothing to suppress the incompatibility. They returned to the warp screaming, and in the screaming, Guilliman heard something he had not expected to hear. He heard relief, not from the demons. The demons' screaming was pure rage and thwarted intention, the sound of entities that had been denied. The relief came from somewhere behind the screaming, but from the deeper layer of the warp where things older and larger than individual greater demons oriented themselves. And what Guilliman heard in that relief was the sound of 4 divine intelligences returning to their natural state of mutual opposition. They had not wanted to cooperate. They had been forced to cooperate by the arithmetic of their own fear, by the calculus that Guilliman's very existence had produced in the strategic mathematics of the long war, by the conclusion that the only response to something that could not be corrupted, could not be outthought, could not be worn down by entropy or broken by grief or seduced by its own desires was to combine against it. Cooperation was against their nature, and he had made it necessary. Guilliman stood in the silence of the ritual's absence, on the dark rock of the dead planet, with the Emperor's sword still extended and its light fading back to the ordinary luminescence of a blessed blade. And he understood something that he had not fully understood before. He was not Chaos's enemy. He was Chaos's problem. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a war that lasted 10,000 more years and a war that ended. He looked at Messinius, who had come to stand beside him with a bolter in each hand, and the particular expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate language for. "My lord," Messinius said. "I know," Guilliman said. "What do we do now?" Guilliman looked up at the wrongly colored star, which was burning slightly less wrongly than it had been 20 minutes ago, as though the removal of the ritual's influence had allowed it to remember what color it was supposed to be. "We go back," he said, "and we build faster." The Macraga's honor felt different on the return transit. Not structurally. The ship was the same vessel it had been for 8 years of crusade, its hull bearing the accumulated repairs and reinforcements of 100 engagements, its corridors carrying the particular smell of a warship that had been continuously occupied for too long, promethium and recycled air, and the specific human mixture of exhaustion and purpose that Guilliman had long since learned to read as a barometer of fleet morale. The ship was the same. The people in it were the same. The void outside was the same absolute darkness that it had always been. What was different was the quality of silence. Guilliman noticed it first in the strategium, where the normal background murmur of cogitator activity and officer communication and the 1,000 small transactions of operational planning seemed to have acquired a new register, not quieter, not louder, but stiller, in the way that air becomes still after a storm is past, and the atmosphere is recalibrating itself toward equilibrium. His staff moved through their duties with the focused efficiency they always maintained. But there was something in the way they moved that suggested awareness of a threshold crossed, a before and after that had not yet been fully processed, but was already reshaping the unconscious architecture of how they understood their work. Vorn found him at the viewport 3 hours after translation, back to Fleet Tertius's position, which was becoming a habit that neither of them had formally acknowledged. "It's the greater demons," Vorn said. "None of them have remanifested in any of our monitored war zones." "They will," Guilliman said. "Banishment is temporary. The warp recovers." "Of course, but the recovery takes time, and the conference—" Vorn paused, assembling his phrasing with the inquisitorial care for precision that Guilliman had come to appreciate as one of his most useful qualities. "The strategic framework they were building won't be reconstructed quickly. Cooperative ventures between all 4 powers require a motivation that overrides their natural opposition. That motivation was specifically the threat you represent. And now they have evidence that cooperation against me produces worse outcomes than their default opposition," Guilliman said. "Yes, that is the calculation I was hoping to establish." He was quiet for a moment. "It will not hold indefinitely. Fear is a strong motivator. They will try again. But not soon. Not soon." He turned from the viewport. "Which gives us a window, not a decisive window. There are no decisive windows in this war, and I have learned to distrust anyone who claims otherwise. But a window of reduced coordinated pressure during which the Indomitus Crusade can advance further than it could have against a unified opposition." He moved to the hololithic table with the measured purposefulness that was, his staff had concluded over 8 years, his fundamental mode of existence. Not urgency, not haste, but the steady forward momentum of a mind that had decided on a direction and was walking it. "I want to use that window for construction, not conquest. Supply lines, communication networks, planetary governance frameworks, the things that persist after the armies move on. Vorn looked at the hololithic display, where the galaxy's eastern arm was marked in the overlapping notations of active war zones, liberated systems, contested territories, and the advancing edges of the Cicatrix Maledictum's influence. It was, as it always was, a picture of a civilization fighting for its life across an impossible scale. The ecclesiarchy will resist the governance frameworks, Vorn said. Yes. The High Lords will resist the communication network expansion. Yes. The Mechanicus will resist the supply line standardization because it reduces their infrastructure leverage. Yes, Guiliman almost smiled. Which is why I'm going to spend the next 6 months doing all three simultaneously, so that the resistance is distributed and manageable rather than concentrated and effective. He looked at Vorn. I have been fighting chaos for 8 years. I have been fighting the Imperium's institutional resistance for just as long. The difference is that chaos is an external enemy. The Imperium's dysfunction is a self-inflicted wound, which means it can be healed, given sufficient time and sufficient will and sufficient acceptance of the fact that healing is slower and less satisfying than conquest. Vorn considered this for a long moment. You sound certain. I am not certain, Guilliman said, with a particular honesty that his most senior staff had come to understand was the truest expression of his confidence, the honesty that admitted doubt without being diminished by it. I am committed. Those are different things. Certainty is a destination. Commitment is a practice. He paused. The Emperor, I think, understood this. I believe, and I acknowledge this is speculation built on inference rather than knowledge, that the Emperor's plan was never intended to be certain. It was intended to be ongoing, a process rather than a conclusion, a civilization that kept choosing to be worth defending rather than one that had been defended into permanence. The viewport beyond them held the stars with their usual indifferent beauty, the ancient light of suns that had been burning since before humanity existed, falling through the armor plass with complete neutrality toward everything it illuminated. He never explained it to you, Vorn said. It was not a question. No. Guilliman's expression held something that moved through several registers before settling on something that was neither grief nor acceptance, but the country between them, where most of his emotional life appeared to be conducted. I used to be angry about that. I spent considerable energy being angry about it, in fact, in the early years after my resurrection. The silence felt like abandonment, like being sent into a burning house and handed a bucket without being told where the fire started. And now? Now I think the silence was the explanation. He looked at the stars. A father who tells his children exactly what to do produces children who can only do what they were told. A father who gives his children the capacity to reason and then steps back produces. He paused. Something that can adapt. Something that can face problems the father never anticipated. Another pause, longer. Or something that fails catastrophically without the guidance it needed. The Emperor gambled. I am still determining whether it was a good gamble. Vorn said nothing, because the statement did not require response, and he was wise enough to know it. Guilliman turned back to the hololithic display. 12 new operational priorities were already queued, assembled by his staff during the transit back from the dead system, each one representing a thread of the Indomitus Crusade's ongoing work that required his attention, his decision, his particular combination of strategic vision and administrative precision, and the simple, continuous act of choosing to keep going. He began working through them, in the warp, in the deep places where the four powers nursed their thwarted intentions and rebuilt their separated strategies and returned to the natural state of mutual opposition that was their truest nature. Something had changed. Not permanently. Nothing in the warp was permanent, which was the warp's greatest strength and its most fundamental limitation. But the shape of things had shifted in the way that the shape of a room shifts when someone moves the furniture. Nothing destroyed, nothing created, but the space reorganized in ways that changed how it functioned. The fear remained. It would always remain because the thing that generated it had not been resolved. Roboute Guilliman was still alive, still thinking, still building, still closing the doors that chaos needed open, and opening the doors that chaos needed closed, and still refusing with the inexhaustible patience of a man who had decided that patience was not a virtue, but a practice, the daily, undramatic, deeply unfashionable practice of continuing. But the fear had changed its shape. It was no longer purely the fear of an enemy. It was the more complicated, more destabilizing fear of something that could not be categorized. Not corruptible, not defeatable, not outthinkable, not exhaustible, not susceptible to the specific instruments that 10,000 years of war had refined against every other obstacle the long war had encountered. In the crystalline towers of the impossible fortress, the architect of the Vandrous withdrawal sat with its 3 golden eyes closed and ran probability cascades against a future that kept refusing to resolve into manageable shapes. In the brass citadel, Ka ran the unfettered, paced its fighting pit, and felt, for the first time in its existence, the specific frustration of rage with nowhere adequate to go. In the garden of Nurgle, the grandfather tended his blooms with careful attention and noted, with genuine scientific interest, that the organism was still growing. In the court of the prince, something that had laughed during a failed conference looked at its reflection in a mirror that showed not appearance but desire, and found the reflection unchanged, and found that more interesting than anything else that had happened. Roboute Guilliman worked through his operational priorities as Fleet Tertius turned its prow toward the next waypoint of the Indomitus Crusade, and the stars did not care about any of it, and the work continued, and that, in the end, in the beginning, in all the long middle of a war that had no finish line, was exactly the point. The 41st millennium does not reward perfection, it rewards persistence. Roboute Guilliman had not destroyed chaos at the dead system. He had not ended the long war, had not healed the cicatrix maledictum, had not resolved the 10,000 compounding crises that the Imperium carried. Like a man carrying wounds, he had stopped counting because counting them changed nothing. He had not received the explanation he deserved from a father who owed him one. He had not seen the Imperium he was building finished, and he would not see it finished in this century, or perhaps any century he would live to witness. What he had done was simpler and more significant than any of those things. He had made the enemy afraid. not of his sword, not of his armies, and not of the post-human force of him standing in a burning room refusing to fall. Afraid of his thinking, afraid of a mind that met 10,000 years of accumulated cosmic malice with the unreasonable, unglamorous, devastating weapon of continued clear thought. Chaos feared Roboute Guilliman more than any other Primarch because Primarchs could be killed, corrupted, broken, turned, driven mad, lost to grief or pride, or the slow entropy of isolation. Guiliman could be none of those things, not because he was invulnerable, he was not because he was certain, he was not that either, but because every morning he woke in the 41st millennium, reviewed the evidence, considered the alternatives, and chose, deliberately, rationally, completely, to keep building. And in a universe whose fundamental nature was entropy, a man who kept building was the most dangerous thing imaginable. The Emperor protects. More stories await.